Okay, as the information developed about the conquistadors coming to the Pueblo, it was refined because one of the women had heard something different. And the issue was that the conquistadors were going to head north out of Santa Fe toward Taos Pueblo to disguise their real target. And they were going to go pretty far to the north so that anybody watching them would be convinced they were heading to this other Pueblo, and then they were going to swing west and south and come back to Feather's Pueblo. So they wouldn't be there the next day, they'd be there the day after. And Feather immediately wanted to, pack up and head south towards the distant mountains, way south. And Cuto got an idea and stopped him before he issued the orders and said, "Listen to me." And so they talked. And the more Cuto talked, the more Feather got a gleam in his eye. And in the end, Feather agreed with Cuto. So what they did was, that night and the next morning, they packed up all the supplies, and the women and children, and all the boys below 13 years old left the next day and headed to the hills to hide. So on the following day, there's a column of smoke, column of dust appears about midday coming towards Feather's Pueblo. And shortly, there appeared 30 foot soldiers and 8 mounted officers. And the foot soldiers were 2 abreast, 15 long, 15 pairs long. And they got closer and closer and got to outside the Pueblo and lined up in a long line facing the U of the Pueblo. Now the U was like this, the long section there, and it wasn't a real U like that. It was just short building sections sticking out from the main middle section. But there was a plaza or dirt in the middle, and the two arms sticking out had 2 floors, 3 floors, and ladders and everything, just like the rest of it. So Marquez was at the head of the column when it arrived. And Marquez had been ordered to find Cuto and the people responsible for rescuing him and bring him back to Santa Fe. Well, Marquez had a different idea. He intended to annihilate the entire village, men, women, and children, using the excuse that he had been attacked. He had no intention of bringing anybody back alive to Santa Fe. So that was his plan. So all the soldiers lined up outside the Pueblo, and they were looking at it, and it was in a complete state. It was in a mess. There was debris and baskets scattered all over the plaza between the 2 arms. The ladders to the second floor, some of them were sort of tipped to one side. Others were completely fallen to the ground. There was garbage, sort of trash, and it was just a mess. And Marquez looked at it and he went bananas. He said, the vermin have left. They fled. And he looked to the south, to the distant mountains, and muttered, they probably headed south to the mountains. I can get some more mounted men, and I can probably track them down before they get to the mountains. And he ordered the troops in to the plaza. And he said, I want you to collect anything that's food on this stuff that's scattered all over the plaza, these baskets and everything that they abandoned when they left here. Set some of these ladders up. He said, I want you to search every single level, including the storerooms on the first level that are shut off, that you have to get up to the second level and go down a ladder into them. Storerooms, everything. He said, you might find somebody hiding. And in his mind, he was thinking, he'll suffer a horrible death after he tells me where they've gone. And so the soldiers marched into the plaza, and the mounted officers, and the soldiers started leaning their lances up against the walls and grumbling about the work they had to do, and started collecting baskets and anything they thought might be usable to take back to Santa Fe. And some of them started straightening up the ladders and climbing up to the second level. And this kind of went on for about 10 minutes or so while they were getting organized. And no one got higher to the second level than halfway up the ladder when, without warning, from behind the low walls that were along the second level, warriors rose up with bows and arrows on all sides of the plaza, and started shooting, and just unleashed a hail of arrows into these soldiers. Some of them point blank. The soldiers were on the ladders. It was point blank, and it took like a minute or maybe a minute and a half before the conquistadors even realized what was happening. And the arrows were well positioned. If anyone they didn't have leg armor, but if anyone had chest armor, the arrows were aimed at neck, legs, or exposed arms. Anything that was not protected by the armor. And in the first volley of arrows, half the soldiers went down. Not all dead, but wounded, writhing around on the ground, wounded. And more arrows came, and Marquez yells the command to get out of there, to get out of the trap in the plaza. But around the corner of the ends came running more archers and sealed off the plaza and started shooting more men, and teams, specially designed teams, sprinted into the melee and grabbed the officers off their horses. Not one arrow was fired at a horse. The officers were all pulled off their horses and brained, stabbed, whatever, but the horses weren't touched. Marquez was basically a coward. Marquez was a coward. He was a sadist, but he was a coward. And when he was the first one, when he said, get out of here, he was the first one. And he broke through that first group of archers that came in. And he thought he was in the clear, but all of a sudden in front of him appeared a last warrior. And he had an impression of a headband and two feathers stuck in a V up out of the headband. And he was spurring his horse, and with his right hand, he gave a vicious swing of his sword and hit the man right in the chest, really hard. And he was thinking to himself, what a great way to escape, cutting a man in two, cutting one of these vermin in two on my way out. The blow of the blow knocked the sword out of his hand. And he spurred his horse away, and he felt something hit his right arm. And then it was pulled back behind him almost out of its socket. And he was almost pulled completely off the horse. And he grabbed the saddle with his left hand and hung on. And the horse was running, and he was being pulled off backwards. And he looked at his arm, and wrapped around his arm was a big ball and leather straps wrapped around his arm. And they were wrapped so tightly they wouldn't come loose. And he couldn't get his left hand free to pull them off because he'd fall off the saddle. And he looked back behind him, and hanging on to two of the leather straps was a warrior being dragged by the horse. But the warrior wasn't letting go of the straps. And the warrior was trying to get to his feet, but the horse was running too fast. Well, after about 100 yards, the horse started to slow down. And the warrior finally got his feet under him and raced up alongside the horse, because the horse was slowing, because he was being ridden, and he was also pulling this guy. And the warrior raced up and grabbed the right arm of Marquez and pulled him off the horse. And the horse kept going. Well, of course, it was Cuto. He had come around with the archers a little bit behind them, getting a little more room to use a sling when Marquez broke through. And he happened to be standing right in Marquez's way, and Marquez delivered this humongous swing of his sword against Cuto, but he had his armor shirt on, and the armor shirt absorbed the blow from the sword. You know, it was a good hit on Cuto's midsection, but it didn't damage anything. And Cuto had the presence of mind, as the sword arm was extended, because they were very, very close together, to flip his sling underhand, loaded with the rock, at the sword arm. And the rock just spun around the arm and locked on the arm. And Cuto hung onto the straps, and the sword fell away, and that's how Cuto was dragged along. And he finally got to his feet and raced up alongside Marquez and pulled him off the horse. When Marquez hit the ground, he started covering his face and crying and screaming, and because he was a coward. He was basically a coward, and blubbering, and just he completely caved in, just blubbering, shaking, crying, begging for mercy with his hands up. And Cuto stood there looking at him, deciding whether he should brain him with the sling or let him go. And finally, and the horse was running on, and he had to decide between Marquez and the horse. And he finally, this didn't take very long. He spit on Marquez and took off after the horse. And he'd later regret that decision. But he took off after the horse, and Marquez got to his feet and ran for the hills. When Cuto came back, the horse ultimately stopped and started grazing, and Cuto caught up to him and led him back to the Pueblo. Feather and his warriors had killed every one of the conquistadors, except, of course, Marquez. The Indians had suffered 1 killed, 3 pretty badly wounded, and about 4 with minor wounds. So a runner was sent to get the rest of the women and children out of the hills back to the Pueblo, and they dragged all the bodies off into a big ravine and buried them. And then set about sweeping out the Pueblo, cleaning it up, and leaving it just abandoned. Not messy abandoned, just abandoned. And the women came back and they assembled food and everything they need. And the next morning, or that night, that evening, they left for the cliff dwelling. And they walked the first 10 miles, night and morning that they walked single file. And they led, the 8 horses were led single file. They took the saddles off them, but they kept the bridles. They led them single file. And behind the group came 3 men with what am I trying to say? Brushes made out of bushes. So they swept the tracks clear. That's what they did for 10 miles. So there was no evidence of what direction they'd gone. And they were counting on the conquistadors to think they'd gone to the South Mountains, which is where the Indians usually went when the conquistadors, when they had an attack or where there was a battle with the conquistadors. So the evening of the day after the battle, they got to the cliff dwelling. And Swallow and Feather showed everybody how to use the handholds and footholds to get down to the cliff dwelling. And they started lowering supplies with ropes down into the cliff dwelling. And Cuto, Ria, and the Aztecs started practicing with the horses, getting up on the horses and walking around on the horses. And it was really different for them. But they had the horses, which was the intent of the whole deal, which was important. And they practiced because Feather had told them that down in the floor of the canyon, and remember, it was a wide canyon. It wasn't a narrow canyon. It was a wide canyon. Down in the floor, there was a secret or a hidden entrance to another valley sunk in the desert floor down to the same level that the canyon was sunk, 200 feet, 300 feet. There was a secret entrance that he had found hunting when he found the cliff dwellings, that he had found, he said, would be a great place to take the horses, and he showed them how to find it. So the next morning, the 7 of them, leading one horse, set off, riding. And they just walked. They just walked. They'd never been on horses before. And they walked along, and Ria was a natural. She moved with the horse. It didn't take her hardly any time to become totally comfortable riding a horse. And so they went 11 miles along the rim, and they came to the game trail that Feather had told them about, going off the rim down to the valley, down to the floor of the canyon, and it was really steep. And the horses had to put their hind legs, sort of bend their hind legs because it was really steep. And the riders didn't fall off, but they had to lean way back, on the horse, along the horse's back, and almost fell off and everything. They finally made it to the bottom on the game trail. And the Aztecs looked at each other and said, I hope we don't have to do that again soon. And they got down to the floor of the canyon, and there was this good stream that they had seen from up above the cliff dwelling flowing. And so they headed upstream, back toward the cliff dwelling. And they covered, 6 miles, almost half the distance, or a little more than half the distance to the cliff dwelling. And came to a small creek running in from the left, from the eastern side of the canyon. The canyon was a half a mile wide. It was not a little canyon. coming in from their left, the eastern side, and joining the main stream. That was the sign that Feather had told them about. So they rode up along this little small creek, and as they got closer and closer, they looked like they were riding into a blank wall, cliff wall, a blank cliff wall, 200-300 feet high. Okay? But as they got within about 20 yards, Cuto saw that there was a separation. There was a piece of rock that looked like it went straight up flat, went straight up all the way to the top of the canyon. But there was a second piece of rock down at floor level that was separated. And out of that separation was coming the stream. So he got to the separation and turned left. And he was on the sandy floor between the two slabs of rock. And then the separation took a right turn and went straight back through the cliff. And above, and there was a crack. They were about 20 feet wide. The separation of rock was about 20 feet wide, and it went all the way up to the top of the desert floor, so they could see blue sky way above them. And so it was about 20 feet, and on one side of the sandy floor was the stream flowing. So they just followed the stream, and they wound a little bit of turn here, a little bit of turn there for about 10 minutes. And all of a sudden, they entered out into a beautiful valley. A beautiful valley. It's about a mile long, about a quarter of a mile wide. Cottonwood trees along the stream. The stream was coming down the whole length of the valley from the far end. These sheer cliff walls all the way up to the desert floor. Cottonwood trees. There were deer grazing out in the valley. Some quail, which are wild birds. A flock of quail flew up in front of them, and it was absolutely beautiful. And the grass was, belly high on the horses. And so Cuto said, let's camp here at the entrance, and we'll turn the horses loose. And so they did. They turned the horses loose, and they made a camp. They spent about the next 4 days walking up to the cliff dwelling, getting supplies, and walking back. And they could get up to the cliff dwelling by the handholds coming up from the floor. So they spent the next 4 days getting supplies, making sure Feather and the people, everybody was, in the cliff dwellings was okay, and they were all okay. No sign of the conquistadors. No sign of them. And about the 5th day, Cuto decides to explore the valley, go up to the end. So he follows the creek up, and the horses are belly deep in grass. Man, they are in seventh heaven, eating grass. They didn't even pay any attention to him when he walked up the valley. He got to the end of the valley, and he saw a hole in the rock where the stream was coming out. And as he got close to it, there were bushes on either side of it. He saw another hole on the right-hand side behind some bushes. And he looked at it, and he pushed his way through the bushes, and it was the opening to a cave. And he bent down and looked inside, and he could see it was a pretty good-sized cave. It was tall enough to stand up in, and it went back. I mean, it was dark in there, but it went back. It was a big cave. So, and crawled inside, stood up, and figured he'd walk as far as he could toward the back of the cave while he still had daylight coming in through the cave entrance. And he had checked out, and he found that from the cave entrance all the way to the end where they were camped, complete view of the valley, and he was sort of hidden by these bushes. So he got in, stands up, and starts walking to the back of the cave, and all of a sudden something catches his eye to his left, and he turns left, and there is a man facing him. And that is the end of the story for today. Now, if you've read this, you can make up what you think, something different than what you know happens. If you have not read this, then why don't you try what you think happens to Cuto next? And we'll find out in the next episode.